Hi everyone. Welcome to e-flux tonight. It's a great pleasure to have with us Oleksiy Radynski, a filmmaker and writer based in Kiev, and he will be showing 3 films that he has done and speaking a bit about the role of social media in the context of social movements and in particular the Maidan revolution. It's maybe important to mention that this talk and presentation is not taking place in relation to the exhibition we have downstairs, Spectres of Communism. It is unrelated to the exhibition. There are no specters of communism here. There is no contemporary Russian art, and there are no contemporary Russian artists in this in this presentation. So Oleksiy will speak a bit to introduce what he will do. He'll start with his film Integration from 2014, and then read a short paper. Continue to his film Referendum, also from 2014, and followed by a short discussion, if you'd like to have. And Incident in the Museum will be the 3rd film screened from 2013. So just to give a short introduction, Oleksiy Radynski is a filmmaker and writer based in Kiev. He is a member of Visual Cultural Research Center, an initiative for art, knowledge, and politics founded in Kiev in 2008. Since 2011, he has been an editor of Ukrainian edition of Political Critique magazine. His texts have most recently been published in e-flux journal and in the publications Soviet Modernism, 1955 to 1991, Unknown Stories, Post-Soviet, Art, Politics, and Society in Russia at the Turn of the Decade, Sweet 60s, Spirits and Spectres of a Parallel Avant-Garde, and others. His latest films include the ones we are seeing tonight, Incident in the Museum, and Integration. Let's give a warm welcome to Oleksiy Radynski.
Thanks a lot for this introduction, and thanks for coming, and thanks a lot for bringing me here. And yeah, as Brian already mentioned, we will start with screening a short film that was produced last year. And those of you who were following or who are acquainted with the events that were taking place in the east of Europe last year could find some of the footage, some of these images familiar. I would just suggest not to perceive this short documentary video as a film about the Maidan revolution, but the film that uses the footage made at the Maidan revolution to speak about the issues of the uprising and what happens to the society, what the uprising and what the revolution does to a society. And after this short screening, I will actually read some notes related in the context of this film, and then we can talk and see more videos. So we can start. I think I remember the moment when I realized that the war in my country has started. The Maidan uprising was still in full swing. The President Yanukovych was still in power, and the Russian invasion of Crimea has not yet taken place. I was filming the clashes between the rioters and the police in front of National Art Museum of Ukraine, and I saw a TV crew that grabbed my attention. The logo on the reporter's mic read Anna News, and I knew the meaning of this abbreviation. It was Abkhazian National News Agency, a media outlet of a self-declared Abkhazian Republic, which was ultimately separated from Georgia by the Russian army in 2008. I also knew that the presence of Anna News in the streets of Kiev was actually a reconnaissance of the military aggressor. Anna News was almost unknown outside Abkhazia at that time. Later on, I have learned that it was actually established with a mission to cover the war in Libya after the fall of Gaddafi, on the side of the loyalists. Anna News actually boasts that most of its reporters are actually the volunteers who don't get paid for their work. But back then, I only recognized the logo of Anna News because I was following the developments of the Syrian war. I knew Anna News because it was the only foreign agency whose reporters had their cameras installed on the tanks of the Assad army during its battles with the rebels. And it was clear that these cameras were war machines just as much as they were media tools. It was also clear to me that they had some special interests in the streets of Kiev. The crew that they came across was filming in between the rows of the riot police. Several months later, they already had their cameras installed on the Russian tanks in eastern Ukraine. But back then, during the Maidan uprising, it was hard to imagine that scores of filmmakers and media activists would soon change their occupation to war correspondents and volunteers. Everything seemed to be quite the contrary. The events at Maidan were caused by a breakthrough of grassroots media activism into big politics. In Kiev, the online protest against integration of Ukraine with Russia has immediately provoked offline assemblies and occupations. And the debate about the future of society actually moved from presidential residences to the squares of Ukrainian cities. But the social network that turned this debate into a full-scale uprising against the regime was actually YouTube, and not Facebook and not Twitter. This happened when the riot police suddenly attacked a minor peaceful protest in the central square of Kiev. The moving images of this crackdown were immediately disseminated on the internet in late November 2013. These images made hundreds of thousands of people occupy not just the streets of Kiev, but also the governmental buildings. So this unexpected role of YouTube in provoking a social uprising means, of course, a new reality for political filmmaking. But in the same time, it reintroduces the old debates of the Soviet avant-garde filmmakers into the context of social media. For instance, Sergei Eisenstein had once denounced the idea of kino-eye, suggested by Dziga Vertov. Eisenstein said, "It is not a kino-eye that we need, but a kino-fist." This meant that political filmmaking needed to have a direct effect on the viewers, and not just to transform their perception of social reality. "Cinema must break through the skull," wrote Eisenstein. By this, he meant that cinema needed to have an instantly mobilizing effect, which would transform the viewer's consciousness. But today, it's not necessary to break through the skulls of the viewers with a masterly avant-garde film work. A simple online video actually may be enough. At Maidan, the broken skulls that Eisenstein used as a metaphor became actual image material. There's a rumor that after the screening of Battleship Potemkin by Eisenstein in Paris in late 1920s, the viewers started to build the barricades immediately outside the film theater. But in Kiev, a low-quality, fuzzy amateur video posted online made people erect the barricades instantly. So all of the social and revolutionary movements were accompanied by the moving image since its invention. And it is hard to avoid the tautological repetition of the word move here, because the image of mass movement, the masses of moving people, itself became a revolutionary factor. Thanks to the moving image, the revolutionary mass becomes conscious of itself as a movement. But what happens when this movement, what happens to this movement when the moving image becomes all-pervasive? The Maidan uprising seemed to realize the dream of directly employing the moving image in political struggle. The occupied squares of Kiev became an inexhaustible source of visual images that were ready to be used as media weapons in the fight against the regime. Well, these events also created an overly advantageous situation for the artists, directors, and all the owners of video cameras, actually. Because on Maidan, it was enough to turn one's lens in virtually any direction to be guaranteed material ready for one's blog or video installation, or simply to be sold to the Western media. But of course, the cost of this material laid in the real tragedies of considerable number of participants of Maidan. They formed the scenery for this documentary blockbuster, and they served as its unpaid extras. The filmmakers, most conscious of their position of privilege in this process, did try to compensate by getting directly involved in the events of Maidan. Some of them have even mastered the technique of throwing the Molotov cocktail without turning off the camera. But, of course, the role of image production in this revolt was not purely cynical. The continuous stream of images coming from Maidan became a direct political instrument. Its role was not limited to mobilization of new participants. The visual documentation of Maidan has forced this uprising into the focus of global attention economy of the media. And this was not only a struggle with the regime, this was a struggle for visibility. The key element of this revolt, both on the practical level and the visual level, was the smoke screen, which was produced by the burning tires, which separated the protesters and the police. At first glance, this smoke simply blocked the security forces' view, disoriented them and prevented their attack. But at the same time, these columns of fire and smoke created an ideal media image. This image assured continuous attention from the international media, which in turn put political pressure on the authorities. So every tire burned on the barricades was converted into a fraction of a second of airtime. And actually the presence of countless cameras and TV crews prevented the ultimate crackdown on the revolt by the authorities. But meanwhile, Anna News Agency and its numerous counterparts were also doing their job. They already smelled that Ukraine could potentially become a new Syria or new Libya, and that a new Abkhazia or Chechnya could emerge in its ruins if they did their job well. And of course, they were aided not just by the powerful international propaganda campaign that Russia has unleashed against the uprising at Maidan. They were also accidentally aided by many of those who participated in the uprising in good faith. First of all, the violence directed at the protesters by the police turned out to be very contagious. This is clearly seen in the self-defense forces of Maidan, which more and more resembled militarized units modeled on the police forces that they were supposed to counter. And this dialectics of violence is actually central to the film that we just saw. Maidan movement was not only an endless source of imagery that could be used in its favor, it was also a source of imagery ready to be utilized as counter-propaganda against the uprising. So the spectacularity of Maidan was its biggest strength and its biggest weakness at the same time. And this spectacular dimension of violence allowed to create a narrative of counter-revolution, a narrative that constructed a direct link between the social uprising and war. So this narrative is very simple. In a nutshell, it says, if there is an uprising against the unpopular government that leads to its overthrow, this may have only one possible outcome, war, be it a hybrid war or a civil war. So, if you are unhappy with your government, think twice before going out to the streets, because otherwise you will actually lose and be deprived of what you already have. And this is exactly the narrative that was supposed to bury the Arab uprisings under the rubble of civil wars in Syria and Libya. And this is exactly the narrative that is behind the counter-revolution in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Crimea, and the igniting of the war in East Ukraine, in Donbass. So the narrative of counter-revolution does not negate the revolution itself. It actually builds on the imagery of the revolution and on its spectacularity. So to undermine a revolution, you need to mock it to create its parodical double. The so-called little green men from the Russian army were actually disguised as self-defense activists in Crimea. And for sure, these men were aided by some authentic volunteers who did much of the effective labor of counter-revolution. So another feature of this counter-revolution is its fixation on past history rather than present conditions or future developments. So here is where the history of a war becomes a tool of resurrecting the war itself. Here I was just watching the second short video. This one was made actually during one day in Crimea during its invasion by the Russian forces.
немцы, если помню, заняли Крым. Точно так же начали все это. Мы все побежали в подвал. Мама, 4 детей. Мы были в подвале. Вот, немцы заняли. До утра сидели в подвале. Потом я выбежала с подвала и смотрю, у нас во дворе была акация большая. На акации висит голова одной девушки вот с такими волосами. Это все было Жуковская 4, вот здесь вот. Потом посмотрела Жуковская 6. Сидит женщина, накрыта белым простынем и плачет. Голова, голова. Я думаю, что она плачет? Я говорю, голова тут, на акации у нас во дворе в 4 номере. Подбежала к ней, 6 лежат, закрыто белым простынем. Я говорю, голова у нас на акации. Тут люди сбежались во двор, достали девушкину голову вот с такими волосами. Это на моих глазах все было, я не могу забыть. И понесли. Ой, доченька, спасибо. А в подвале мама еще с 3 детьми сидит в подвале. Они не знают, что война на улице. Депортировали татарских. Ночью 2 часа пришли, выходите. Ни тапочки, ни одежды, ничего нет. Голые в одних рубашках. Нас повезли в вокзал, на товарных поездах погрузили нас. И вот куда-то отправили. 2 года братишки, 4 года сестренки, 6 лет сестренки. И я самая старшая, с 34-го года рождения. И так мы ехали товарным, закрытые, голые, голодные. Приехали ночью в Средней Азии. Состав остановился, нас выгрузили. Одна я была, детей вот так отняла, все вот такие вот худые. Я одна выжила, все скончались, всех похоронили. Приехала сюда, на землю, вот тут наш дом был, дом, вот тут, Жуковская 4, дом правительства было, нету, сидела, плакала, нету. Вот так моя жизнь, вот такое у меня детство, вот. И завтра опять пойду на выборы, на референдум, а что будет после референдума, не знаю.
Мы живем на отцовской земле, внуки старого, славные дети, и летит на крылатом коне Русь далекие тысячелетия.
Before we proceed to the next part in the third film, maybe should
If
make
you have
a
any
little
questions, we can ask them for maybe 15 minutes or so.
it's up to us, basically.
You said that the social media was primarily YouTube. How were YouTube videos shared then? Was that primarily through email?
Sorry. You mentioned that the YouTube videos were the main social object, not Facebook or Twitter. So how were the videos shared? Was that through email or through some other network?
Yeah, so the videos were basically shared on Facebook, on Twitter, on Vkontakte, on various other medias, on email. What I meant by the ultimate role and the function of the videos, that they were actually, the moving image was basically the major mobilizing force that led people out to the streets, that made them actually leave the computer, leave the monitors, and actually exit the reality of the social media and go out to the streets. Of course, it doesn't mean that that YouTube as a website was kind of an ultimate media tool, but YouTube as a medium for the moving images was actually crucial. So of course not YouTube Corporation and not Google, but the moving image itself was, as I think, the crucial thing in this uprising.
Can you talk a little bit more about the kind of presence, or the heavy presence, and the role of religion in this whole situation? Because it's extremely strong in everything that you're presenting, and I'm fascinated in that aspect of it.
Yeah, this is a very important question, because it's also a very important counterpart and an addition to the digital media discourse and the social media discourse, which was very much present on Maidan. But the way religion was present was actually very much, in a way, kind of postmodern or kind of social media based, because this has to do with the structure of the public space and of this revolt that I'm not sure is represented in this particular film. So there was a stage in the middle of the square, and the stage was operating 24/7. So in order to entertain people and to keep their spirit up 24/7, you practically need to have something on the stage. And you cannot really have a rock concert 24/7. So this led to the overwhelming and exaggerated presence of religion, of prayers, of religious practices on this stage, because once you put a priest on the stage, he can actually occupy the air for, I don't know, an hour at least. Yeah, so this is, I would say that this is the reason why this became so visible. This video is actually about the visibility, about the representations that were there. So I actually think that it's that it represents the role of religion in a way.
Well, out of many things I loved, I love particular way you can make symmetry between movement as a part of revolutionary movement. So you kind of need to move people for something to happen, and movement as the essential feature of at the beginning of cinema. It was beautiful. So what I want to ask you, since you also invoked work of Eisenstein, right? It's natural to say, okay, what's the difference between their cinematic language and the cinematic language you use, especially in the first film, but also second film, right? So I think the position of the camera almost overshot. You're basically inside the crowd, right? You're inside the protesters. I mean, there are no like faraway shots. There are no shots from above, which means that regardless of what your, let's say, ideological idea, right, was, you tend to identify, I think, with protesters because you become one inside them. So I think this kind of point of view interpolates you, right, into being one of them, which of course is very different from Eisenstein/world of montage, where you have lots of faraway shots, right, lots of editing, lots of points of view from below, from above. And of course, Eisenstein and Vertov also wanted to convey a very strong ideological position, but perhaps besides what we wanted, you get these gaps between shots, right, which maybe leads to a certain ambiguity. But in your case, so I don't know to what extent you're kind of aware that you have this very selective, right, camera position, and how you yourself think about it. Because somebody can say, well, this actually doesn't allow us to have any kind of critical distance, right? It basically positions us literally inside the movement. You can become one of them, and you inevitably have to support it.
Yeah, thanks for this question. Actually, in one of the episodes of this film, which I think is an important one, the camera is positioned among the ranks of the riot police, which me and the cameraman that I worked with were extremely lucky to do. It was very unlikely that anyone with a camera would be led there, but we kind of mentioned to infiltrate their ranks. So this kind of is supposed to kind of sublate this one-sided perspective, or this also introduces the perspective of the other side of the conflict, which I think is also crucial for the film. It was, of course, we were extremely limited in time. We couldn't film there for a long time. We were chased away. But one thing that I would like to attract the attention is kind of artworks that the riot police were producing. Some of them are in the film. They were extremely bored in between the clashes, so they were producing kind of the woodcuts or something like this. And one of these woodcuts actually is a slogan saying that our cause is right, the victory will be ours. So this is actually, for me, a very important link to this kind of counter-revolutionary logic. So the riot police is not simply doing their job. Some of them actually, at least some of them, were thinking that their cause is fighting this uprising, their cause is kind of suppressing this uprising, and they were kind of expressing this through this kind of spontaneous artworks. Yeah, and there is actually a couple of the bird view shots in the film. I'm not sure if this answers the question, actually.
No, it does. I think maybe I was just reporting on my overall impression, but it's like that was my reading. But maybe for somebody else, like this few outside shots were very important. For me, I was like really felt okay. I'm marching. But it's one reading. Thank you. But I think the slogan which you said, like our cause is right, victory is ours. To me, it felt like something directly from World War II or 1970s. It felt like a goal at the time.
Yeah, and the music that they were played, that they were listening to, is actually one of the hymns, one of the most important hymns of the Soviet army in the World War II, which is actually familiar to any kind of Soviet or post-Soviet citizen. There is an important aspect here that this song was actually, which is originally in Russian, and everyone knows it in Russian. This song was played to the riot police in its Ukrainian translation. But this is kind of a very kind of marginal detail that. Yeah, so I was talking a little bit about how history became a tool of kind of inciting the war, and more specifically about how the history of the war became the tool of inciting the war. But it's actually important to look how the culture and the arts in the broader understanding may also be utilized as the war instruments, as instruments that pit citizens against each other, and as the kind of politically engaged art, which we are used to think of in the terms of the leftist politics, but actually, if we look at how the right wing and the conservative and the extreme right and the chauvinistic right is utilizing arts, is extremely important. And in the context of my country, this was actually a really important tool of kind of provoking the war in the country. So in this context, I thought of the film that I actually made 2 years ago. So it was really way before the Maidan uprising and way before this whole unexpected turn of events started. This is a film that is called Incident in the Museum. It was filmed literally by incident. It's also a short documentary. After this, we can continue.
Видите, то светится, то не светится.
Музей. Скоро будет 43 года, как я в музее работаю. У нас была смотрительница зала, она защитница Сталинграда, медсестрой, девочкой, таскала раненых под пулями, под огнем. Потом работала учительницей. Под Сталинградом она застудила почки и всю жизнь потом мучилась почками. И вот она, эта бабулечка, сидит вот так, у нее ручки на коленках, а с этой и с этой стороны на нее, к ней обращены образ, автопортрет Бориса Михайлова в обнаженном виде и плюс еще вот такого примерно размера фаллос накладной искусственный. И все это обращено как бы вот в эту сторону. Она фланкируется этими двумя фигурами. Конечно, я закрою эту выставку. Конечно, закрою. Наша коллекция, она одна из самых старых в Украине и одна из самых ценных в Украине. Случается революция, и тогда начинается, одна из жутких страниц в истории нашего музея, все собирают из университетского и художественно-промышленного музея все в одну кучку. Образуют центральный художественный исторический музей. Извините, может быть, это все не пришел. Алло, да, прибыли, да? Хорошо, ладно. Давайте прервемся.
Мой дядюшка был внуком Серова, Валентина Серова.
Посмотри,
Мы хотели сделать предварительный заход.
А мне нравится.
Не на бегу и не на скаку.
Значит, прежде чем мы пойдем в музей, я буквально несколько слов. Благословите, батюшка.
Ваша. Очень важно, чтобы у нас осеняли ангельские крылья.
Да, спасибо. Значит, мы...
Прошу вас, не откажите.
Я чуть-чуть вам расскажу об истории драматической и поэтической, и прекрасной, и жуткой.
Директор музея говорит, чтобы батюшка по пути раздавал подарки. Ангел хранитель. Так как вы хранители, то ты жалуешься. Какой хороший.
Отец Арсений, московский проповедник известный, он духовник Путина.
Так и хочется положить туда медяшечку какую-то вот в это поднос. Иван Васильевич, вам, конечно, от живописцев досталось немало. Ну, вот. Вам вот не достался подарок.
Ой, спасибо.
Ангел-хранитель. Место проездного. По жизни действует.
Спасибо. У меня есть, вот дали.
Еще кому-нибудь.
Спасибо. А благословите.
Дай мне здоровья. Вот надо бы вернуть женщине то достоинство, которое глядит с картин рока. А тут все приоделись, джинсы, правда? Смотрите, какие. Прямо каждая как царица.
Мы не против.
А?
Мы не против вернуть.
Какие дамы, какой стати. Наверное, подбирали себе и женихов соответствующих, правда?
В том числе и Вазовский.
Ну, а ты из Вазовского, простите, москалей отгонять нельзя.
Да, Айвазовский. У нас и наверху есть Айвазовский. Вот Айвазовский.
А вот мне кажется, что вот этот плотик какой-то мотив с 9 валом. Там тоже
Да, совершенно верно.
правда?
Мотив близок. Да. Мотив
И даже
близок.
угадывается в картине 9 вал как будто такая крестовидная форма. Я думаю, может, это символ какой-то? Крестовидная форма этого плотика.
Не задумалась. Может и символ.
Нет, ну правда похоже.
Мгм.
Правда похоже.
Портрет Павла Первого.
Павел Петрович, мы очень рады, что попали под ваши ясные вельможные очи. Харьков сейчас переживает сложный момент своей истории. Нужно изменить сознание масс. А массы теперь выживают за счет гастарбайтеров. Какие-то два негра ходят по Харькову по утрам. Как из книги Мэри Поппинс, там были две дылды, сестры, и они клеили серебряные звезды. А здесь два негра убирают лентики. Павел Петрович, благодарим вас, простите, что не так, но мы ваши почитатели, и мы надеемся, что еще история великой малой белой Руси не сказала своего последнего слова. Сейчас меня сразу арестуют, Павел Петрович. Директор музея просил вам передать благословение. Очень милое. Не откажете.
Всех поражает всегда вот работа Кившенко, потому что даже у каждой собаки свой характер найден. Во всем, в каждой мелочи художник
Я нашел
стремится
себя
найти.
здесь. Мы, батюшки, очень законопослушные существа, и я привык всегда перед директором благоговеть. Это
И я буду надеяться, что это
только
пристрелка. Правильно, да.
Пристрелка. И одного посещения музея достаточно, чтобы понять и почувствовать. Мне самому теперь хочется взяться за кисть, может быть, и с запозданием. Все возможно в этом подложном мире. Прощаемся с тобой, дорогой музей, в надежде на то, что свидимся вновь.
Yeah, so actually one of the statements that he does is really important. I think, to me, I actually found it even much more important in the context of the war between Russia and Ukraine that is lasting. So at some point he says that I really hope that the story of the great Russia, the white Russia, and the little Russia is not over yet. So the great Russia is kind of Russia, Russian Federation, in the mythology of the chauvinist Russian right. The white Russia is Belarus, and little Russia is Ukraine. So he is actually saying that he hopes that the common history of these three Russias is not over yet, and then he says that he hopes he doesn't get arrested upon leaving the museum, referring to an apparently kind of nationalist regime of Ukraine that would kind of suppress this kind of statements. Yeah. The other thing I have actually wanted to explain that he is not the confessor of Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin has actually a confessor and a spiritual father, but this is not this guy. There's a different guy who does this for Putin, but he is kind of a self-declared man. And actually the only reason why all this was happening is that all of the stuff in this museum in Kharkiv, which is in East Ukraine, actually thought that for some obscure reason that he actually was the confessor of Putin. So this had this kind of additional dimension of reference to one of the famous plays by Nikolai Gogol, Revizor. I actually don't remember the English translation. So it's a story about a man who comes to a small town and everyone thinks that he's very important, that he's a revisor and he's actually nobody, but everyone behaves as if they are encountering the confessor of Vladimir Putin, who knows a lot about power, history. This is something I felt like I had to explain here. And the other thing is that towards the end of the film, he says that his visit was actually a reconnaissance, and he uses kind of a very precise military term in Russian, which means reconnaissance, which is derived directly from the military language. This is kind of reconnaissance. It is the English word. So he also sees himself not just as an artist, but as a kind of someone who makes a military reconnaissance to enemy terrain before the actual troops come in.
You weren't accidentally there when this person turned up, so your role is actually quite different in this film to what you've been presenting beforehand. So can you talk a little bit about that, because there's a way in which you know that there's something that is going to happen that you want to be able to portray, rather than something that you don't know that maybe you can piece together. So can you talk about the difference?
Yeah, sure. So I will just start with the context, how this was filmed. This is actually an offshoot of a research project that has nothing to deal at first with this man. It was a research project into the relations of art and power in the post-Soviet Ukraine. So we just came to interview this museum director who is famous for her really hardcore stance on the contemporary art, and she banned many exhibitions, and she banned an exhibition of Boris Mikhailov, who is a very famous artist from Kharkiv, when he made an exhibition in this museum. So this is a true story. And then really the phone rang on her desk, and there was this guy coming, and she actually, there's another thing that she told him, that we are a TV crew, because we told her that we are a TV crew, and she thought we are a TV crew, so he thought that it's really cool that he will be filmed. Yeah, but the question is, answering your question, I think it's, there is of course the difference between like filming the event that you know that what you are filming, and when you don't know, because actually it's very hard to compare these two contexts, but in a way it's easy, since as I was trying to mention in these notes, the uprising is a kind of a situation that you feel like really like a privileged, guilty someone, that you have a camera and you basically can direct it anywhere, and wherever you direct it, you will have the material that you need. This is the nature, kind of cinematic nature of the uprising, which of course is not that simple, and of course you cannot get the material that you need by simply filming the uprising and so on. But in a way, I think like me and my comrades with whom we were doing this research, we just figured out that we should go to this museum and talk to this lady, and that of course it was a complete surprise that such a spectacular outcome that we received. Actually, this is part of the bigger research, and some of the things that she told to us in this hours-long interview. Because after this visit was over, we came back to her desk, and she told us much more. So a lot of what she told us was actually like really interesting, maybe much more interesting than this performance by this guy. But unfortunately, there is the sense that when you make a film, it should be kind of performative. Like you can have a talking head for an hour, but you will probably be bored and so on. So this film became kind of an offshoot that, in a sort of condensed form, represents the discourse that we were trying to research.
So earlier, you made a kind of argument, powerful statement that YouTube was, very important in fact making revolution happen. So when I was researching the use of social media, kind of in the Maidan movement, for our own project, I found kind of statements. I mean, there's a few articles, right, which have been done, not a lot. And what people are saying in these articles that, like things like Twitter and maybe also Facebook. On the one hand, right, we become places where, like, to organize revolutions, right? Like, in fact, supposedly Maidan started when one of the famous journalists posted, "Let's go to Maidan." And it's a place where people can keep up events and people can mimic each other's actions. But of course, it's also a place where government can post their stuff. And supposedly, maybe people from some hackers employed by government, or maybe hackers or simply programmers employed by Russian government, also posting kind of lots of counter propaganda, right? So to that extent, with social media, like popular social media becomes, it's a sword, right, which has kind of, goes in both directions, right? The same place can become a place for, engagement, but of course it also becomes a place where the other side can very powerfully use for disinformation. So I don't know if you have some opinion about it, or maybe you and your friends did some actual research about it, because what I read were more like people thought about it. So one of the reasons we used Instagram in our project, it seems like Instagram was left alone. So yes, participation was very low, but it seems like never pro-Maidan people nor against Maidan people actually posted. But then of course you can also say that Instagram, because it was so small, was not important, whereas Facebook, and YouTube. Anyway, if you have some comments, because I think it's a very important topic.
I agree. It's really important, and I think there is really important distinction between different kinds of mobilization through social media and try to elaborate on this. So I would like go in a little bit more detail about how it all happened through social media. So there is this official story of the start of the uprising at Maidan that you mentioned, and that I actually also mention often in my writing, that there was this Facebook post by Mustafa Nayyem, who said that let's meet at Maidan at some point, at a certain time. And as a result of this post, some 100 people came, or 200 people came, and then it slowly developed into like in a small occupation, which was really small actually, which would dissolve in a matter of weeks or days, if the escalation wouldn't happen. And actually, the fact that it's often overlooked is that the first really huge, like an uprising occupation that brought, like, no one knows exactly how many, but several 100,000 people, was a result of the crackdown, and which was actually filmed, which was posted on YouTube, and which mobilized like incomparable numbers of people. So I think this is maybe an important distinction that actually should be looked at in a more attentive way, but which also can give a clue about this kind of use of social media for propaganda or counter-propaganda, because of course, and maybe it can also become something like a measure of, I don't know, authenticity, if we still can talk of authenticity nowadays, but still, of course, the counter-movement and the counter-revolution that happened actually in spring last year was also kind of stemming from the social media. It was organized in the social media and orchestrated in the social media, like Facebook and, more importantly, Vkontakte, which is the Russian rip of Facebook. But I don't remember any kind of mobilization that is comparable to this mobilization, which I think is authentic. Like, it's all the reservations that we have to authenticity in the age of social media. But I think that you can actually see this when we have like several 100,000 of people on the street overnight who came out because they actually saw this this video. Like, they came for various reasons, but the kind of the push that or the source of the information that they discovered about this crackdown, about the beating, and which made them really indignant, was this kind of video posted online. So when this kind of mobilization happens, I think it's something really different from any kind of Facebook or Twitter organized movements. It's also very different from this Maidan assembly that was provoked by this Facebook post.
And this video you're referring to, it was not saying what the Maidan, right? This video was basically showing kind of violence which took place, and then people next day we go. So it suggests a kind of strong causal relationship.
Yeah, it was very much a cinema verite video. It was just a pure footage of the beating, kind of violence porn or something like this. It was not the call to go out actually.
At the museum, there were very few men there. Is that part of the museum's hiring policy, or is it maybe just indicative of cultural attitudes toward art?
Yeah, but there is a man, and
well,
yeah. He's not an employee of this museum. But actually, I haven't seen. It's not a matter of editing. I haven't seen a single man among the staff of this museum, and yeah, it's true that. Cultural institutions and art institutions in my part of the world are basically run by women, and women are the employees. I don't know what the situation here, but I think I read the text by Hita Steil where she says that it's the same. Yeah, so which also, and of course, he's not like the protagonist of this film, or an antagonist, I don't know. he's not just extreme conservative and chauvinist and so on. This is also, this culture has very much to do with male supremacy also. This is something that, for instance, Pussy Riot are working with, for example. So, yeah, basically you are right. This observation, I can only agree that, yeah, that there are no men in this case.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the relation of the scenario in the museum to Maidan, yeah, and the relation between these films, and how do you whether you see them being related and how.
Well, I wasn't seeing them being related. Probably they are unrelated. Well, actually, when this museum film was made, it was half a year before, and we had no clue that something like this could happen. But as I said, one important context for this film, which is a link, is that actually the Russian conservative discourse and the Russian chauvinist discourse actually was all the time seeing Ukraine as their property, and they were seeing Ukrainian identity and Ukrainian statehood as a kind of misunderstanding or a plot by the West to take away their what belongs to them. So this is pretty much obvious for a very long time. Also relating to the issue of religion, which, as was mentioned before, was very much important at Maidan, and so the priests in the Maidan film and this guy, they actually belong to the same religion, the Orthodox Christianity, but they belong to separate versions, to different versions of the Orthodox Christianity. And so he is the representative of the Moscow Christianity. And he, of course, the most obvious relation is that he is seen as a symbol of power, that he is seen as a representative of Vladimir Putin, which in combination with his religious kind of affiliation makes him a very much important symbolic figure. And the uprising at Maidan was actually not so much about European Union or European values. It was very much about Putin and about Russian colonialism. And it was basically very much an anti-colonialist, anti-imperialistic uprising, directed towards the discourse and the values that actually this guy represents, if there is any relation.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to add that I also read your museum work somehow as anticipating what is happening, because I think that museums somehow are institutions that are among many other institutions, but particularly barometers of the social and like political situation and social tensions, particularly in, let's call it, Eastern Europe. Like if you look at the museum situation in that region, it's very telling, you know, in what is happening in each country. For example, a museum in Belgrade, both of contemporary art and the National Museum, they've been closed for almost 20 years. In Poland, they're building a lot of museums. You know, in Budapest, they built a museum which at the beginning was showing mainly Western art. So somehow, you know, the fact of the director who is like closing the museum for like Mikhalkov's show, in the, you know, permitting the priest to go and bless out is like really telling on what's the political situation of the country. So I don't know if this was the reading that you had in mind, but.
Yeah, thank you for this comment. It was a kind of a reversal, I think, of the logic of anticipation, because I totally agree with what you say about the role of museums, and not only in that part of the world, but basically. But also, this is just the question of me personally being a little bit feeling weird about all of this art that anticipated Maidan in a way. Like all Ukrainian art nowadays is represented as an anticipation of Maidan. So unfortunately, one has to distance from any kind of anticipations, which doesn't mean that it's unrelated. Because of course, if you look at kind of social issues, or if you deal with political issues in your work, then it's obvious that it will have something that has to do with this kind of a revolution if it happens. Yeah. So what I wanted to say is just that this is not the reason why this film is included here.
But it's,
yeah,
when I said
yeah.
anticipation, maybe it's a wrong word. Somehow it's not even announcing, but it's very telling about what is happening.
Yeah, I think that at least in the relation of the tremendous influence of religion on politics, and of politics on religion, and of politics and religion on art, I think that there is actually a link between this. Yeah. But I was actually discovering it myself also.
I just want to ask you if you know what happened with this museum or anyone after. Like, did you ever look back to know if the museum is still there, if she's still there? Is there any change in the context now? That would be interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, she is still there. She is there for over for 43 years. Now it's 45. So soon it's an anniversary. I think that she will make a 50th. So I think that in 5 years she will celebrate the 50th anniversary of her work in this museum. So basically, it didn't change. Of course, this is kind of important in the context of what is going on in the eastern part of Ukraine, because this city and this museum is in the east. It's actually only 40 kilometers from the Russian border. It's still in a peaceful condition, so it wasn't invaded by the Russian army. It didn't have a real separatist movement because it didn't really have the Russian mercenaries. So the city of Kharkiv is okay now, and everything is running smoothly, and the institutions are operating, and the art museum is still operating. I think that the only profound change that actually happened is that this guy can no longer kind of enjoy the artworks in this museum, because I think that he can no longer enter Ukraine, or at least I hope so, because there were certain restrictions imposed on certain Russian citizens, on certain people affiliated with the Putin regime, that banned them from entering Ukraine for obvious reasons. Actually, lots of them can enter Ukraine through porous border in Donbas region, because for the 400 kilometers of Russian-Ukrainian border is not controlled by anyone except like the mercenaries. So yeah, so maybe I'm being too optimistic, but basically, yeah, I think that one thing that changed is that this kind of situation is no longer happening there. The museum ladies are not getting their blessings.